So we're going to get started now. So thank you for sticking with us after the film. And now we're going to do our panel discussion for Judging the Machine with Joanna, Helen, and Micah. And first of all, I have, a couple of slides around the topic, which will hopefully come up on screen very shortly. Maybe? Yes, here they are. So as you may know, Judging the Machine is one of the events that we're kicking off our program of algorithmic superstructures with. And just to start off with, if you're not familiar with the term of AI, here is a diagram that explains a little about how some of these systems work. So they work by looking at large amounts of data and then finding patterns and then kind of generating recommendations or images or texts based on that. And commonly used to judge or recommend films and songs in our various entertainment programs, but also sometimes looking to judge what is considered beautiful or professional, such as in these examples from 2016 that come from Google image search. So if you look for professional hair, you have a lot of kind of thin and European-looking faces. And if you look for unprofessional hair, then it's often kind of African hair. And then I was looking actually at this today as well to see if this example is still the same 2 years after, and this is what I get now. So the professional hair has kind of moved on to incorporate a variety of different hair types, but the unprofessional hair now seems to be partly about this discussion about what is actually considered beautiful, which is something I didn't quite expect. But this does go to show that some of these systems are also developing partly based on the public response. But there are always difficulties, and there are always projects such as this Stanford research project that claims to identify whether a person is gay based on a photograph. And the science behind that is somewhat controversial, particularly from the perspective of the technical community. But that doesn't stop the media from including this as an example. And of course, there are cases in various legal systems, such as in the US, where algorithms are used to help make the decisions in sentencing by assessing the risk of a person. So these are just some examples of how algorithms judge or are involved in judging or assessing the suitability of us humans, both in terms of beauty and our ability to gain access to services, or even in our ability to stay free or incarcerated. So with this panel, we'd like to address some of those issues and see what can be done and where responsibilities lie in terms of fairness, accountability, and transparency regarding algorithms. And so we're going to start off with Joanna. And what can I tell you about Joanna? So Joanna Bryson is a transdisciplinary researcher on the structure and dynamics of human and animal-like intelligence. Her research covers topics from AI through autonomy and robot ethics and onto human cooperation, and it has appeared in venues ranging from Reddit to Science. So, welcome, Joanna.
right. Well, I'm going to start. Thank you very much for having me here. I really enjoy this. I normally talk in science and increasingly in policy circles, but I love artists, so this is great. And I've been really excited by the extent to which you guys have really seen and gotten to grips with how much we're already wrapped up in AI. So I was asked for these slides in advance, and I'm going to go Pomo on you a little bit and talk about the slides and not always give the slides. Right? But the first thing I want to do, what? I'm happy. Oh, what, without or with? What? No, okay, right, okay. All right, so, yeah, I can stand closer to it, that's all right. So where were we? Right, so the first thing I want to do is just give some definitions. All right, can you hear it now? Is that okay? All right, so I'm going to give you some definitions, and I want to say these are not the universally accepted definitions, although with for most cases, they are going to be the same ones as that you, well, I'll say as I go. Okay, so this is a really simple definition of intelligence. You can find it in behavioral ecology, which also used to be known as ethology. So this is like an area of biology that looks at behavior. But also you can find it in Patrick Winston's book on artificial intelligence, which was like the textbook of artificial intelligence for like 30 years, up until about the 1990s. All right, intelligence is just doing the right thing at the right time. Okay, it's just being able to recognize and then express behavior to adjust to a changing world. All right, now this is a very simple example. It's deliberately set so that you can say something like that a thermostat is intelligent, or a plant, right? Because a plant recognizes the light and grows towards it. You can even call the plant itself sort of its own memory, right? So this is a really simple kind of intelligence. You wouldn't call those cognitive. Neither a thermostat nor a plant can learn how to learn, but they can respond to their environment, okay? All right, what about an agent? People say, well, what if it's become an agent? Well, again, this depends on who you're reading. Different philosophers say different things, but for the next 15 minutes, when I say agent, I just mean that you're creating change. So for example, there are chemical agents. That's the chemicals that cause a reaction. Right? So that in itself is not the big deal. The big deal is this, all right? Moral agency, that's what we really care about. It's about who is it that's responsible for the action, okay? And the interesting thing here is that is socially defined. So different countries have different ideas at what point a child is an adult, right? That you'll be tried by as an adult. In the past, we even thought maybe animals were responsible agents, and we might hang an animal, hang a pig if it killed a child, right? Now we don't think animals are moral agents. Moral patients are, again, considered the responsibility of a society's agents. And different societies feel differently about what we should do. For example, somebody with a drug problem. Is that person the agent, or is society responsible for taking care of them, or are both true, right? We're changing our ideas about the environment. Again, this is debated, but some people consider the environment to be a moral patient. It's clearly not a moral agent. We don't hold it accountable for an action. So this is all things that you could find elsewhere. This is the weird thing, okay, that I was warning you about. I am going to go from these two things and say that ethics itself is determined by a society. And that's why we see different societies defining, and again, arguing about not only how old are you before you can stand trial, but also what do you have to wear in order to be a citizen? Are you able to drive? Things like that. And part of that, so what I'm going to say is ethics is all the behavior that makes you a society. It's the behaviors by which a society sustains itself. So this is going to be very important when we think about artificial intelligence, right? Where does artificial intelligence fall into this? The first place it falls is just this. Artificial intelligence is intelligence that's been deliberately built. It's an artifact. The A stands for artifact. Okay, it is not a space alien that just arrived like 2 years ago. It's something that someone has chosen to build, and also something that someone has chosen to use. And I loved the film, but if there was one thing that bothered me about it, it was the idea that the company had gone bankrupt, but the algorithm was still running. right? So the idea here is that something has to decide to build and to run it, and if it keeps running, then okay, that could happen, but it seems like a bug. It seems like something that should be shut down. So if you're talking to governments, we are now, what the basic regulatory question is there anything about this technology that changes legal responsibility for that intentional act? So the main thing I tend to argue is basically no, okay? Basically, this is like you had a car. And if the car fails, the brakes fail because they were built wrong, then it's the company's fault. But otherwise, if it's the driver that didn't push the brakes, then it's the driver's fault. It's never the car's fault itself, right? We don't sue the cars, all right? So, but this is debatable, and so we'll get to that. Okay, one of the things that people get confused about with intelligence is that unfortunately people think it's math, artificial intelligence. They think computation is math. It's like some reasoning, it's a higher perfect thing, right? But actually, it depends on computation, and computation is a physical process. This was already said. This was done beautifully in the film, actually. The fact that it is something physical and it's real. I just had an argument with some really bright, graduate student who said, you're missing everything because you don't see that we're moving into a digital era. Digital era is post-physics. No, it isn't. Where are the digits represented? They have to be represented in electricity. So first of all, I don't think it's coherent to think that you will have the motivation necessarily in a fully computerized world. But secondly, it would still be physical, right? So what does this mean? Computation takes time, it takes energy, and it takes space. Okay, that's why you have to buy bigger memory for your computer every so often. You actually do have to store what the current memory is, right? What the current state or knowledge of the system is. All right. So finding the right thing to do at the right time requires search. You have to. There's all these different things you could do. And the cost of search is, a little bit of math, the number of options raised to the number of possible actions. All right? So if I had a robot that could do 100 things, and I told it that it had to go to Tokyo or something, and it only knew how to do 100 things, but it knew that it had to do 2 of them to get to go, well, if it had to do if it was just guessing, it might have to guess one of these 100 things might get me to Tokyo. Oh, that didn't happen. Okay, maybe if I did 2 of them in a row, that's already 10,000 possible plans. Okay, this is combinatorial explosion. This is the real problem of intelligence. So the number of 35 move games of chess is greater than the number of atoms in the universe. All right, and so that's just the short games of chess, not the ones where you push a rook back and forth forever, right? So it's not something that we're just going to store on a spreadsheet or something, right? The trick of intelligence is how do you solve all these problems? And we're just scraping the barrel of what we could possibly do. All right. I think I'm going to skip this part. There are ways to go faster, but basically, like concurrency, I'll say this. Concurrency means doing things at the same time. And the reason I want to mention this is because this is what society is. That's why you buy more processors. Remember, you buy more processors in your computer, so you're using, if you have 8 processors, you're using 8 times as much memory. 8 times as much memory, 8 times as much electricity, right? But you get to do it at the same time, and that's great. And you can think of all of us as our society as like 8 billion people that are using our brains. And of course, our brains have trillions of nerve cells, right? So concurrency is what biology uses, all right? So it saves time, but it doesn't save energy, and it requires more space. You have to find a place to put those 8 billion people. And I'm not going to talk about quantum computing here. You can ask in Q&A. But basically, there's no evidence that it's going to help on the energy front. It does save both time and space. Okay. So right. We don't have to worry. And again, you guys have been great. In other contexts, I have heard people say, oh, like maybe China is going to develop the super deep learning algorithm and it's going to suddenly know everything. No. From what I've told you before, we can get better and better at machine learning, but we're never going to know everything. For one thing, every time we have a new algorithm, we have more stuff we can do. Okay, so yeah, as I mentioned, humanity's winning ecological strategy is that we share what we know. It's language that's been a big part of this, that we can communicate when we find a good result, okay? And since that's become our adaptive strategy, it's not just that we've gotten good at talking, we actually even give more pheromones than any other monkey or ape. All right? It's incredible. Anyway, so we are the sharing species. And now we do this with machine learning. All right? So when we talk about AI, again, you guys are here. I used to really have to say, AI is not something 20 years in the future, but you guys get this. It's here now, and it's changing who and what we are. Okay? So I don't have to go into details about this. But the important thing here is that this is because we've gotten really good at taking the knowledge that we already had, either explicitly in our culture, reading things, or implicitly by uploading it. Okay, 5 already, okay. So, or implicitly, like that guy up there, it's actually biological knowledge that's been uploaded by machine learning, all right? So one consequence of this is that AI is not necessarily better than we are. And again, you guys, or at least the people yesterday that had heard about this, so I'll skip over it very quickly. But I do want to point something out, which is that all we did to get this result, so this is the implicit biases, right? Basically sexism and racism that you can go find out you have if you play on a computer game, implicitly. It doesn't mean explicitly you're a bad person. So your conscious mind can stop you from doing what your unconscious mind expects the world to be like, which is one of the things that we showed, which was really surprising. So the same thing, the same algorithm that is giving this racist or sexist response also gives a really accurate description of these dots represent jobs, like what proportion of those jobs are held by women. So this sexist thing thinks that like, oh, women are not programmers, they're more likely to be nurses. Well, they actually are, right? And which was actually very depressing. But anyway, because when I was a programmer, that was more like up here. But anyway, that's another story. I see I only have about 4 minutes left, so I want to skip quickly through this. Well, I will say this part here. Yeah, don't forget it's built. But I want to skip through this. Sorry, this is really cool talk. I'm going to skip over this. I'll talk about this briefly. Architects used to be like programmers, right? They used to just go and build buildings whenever they wanted to. But now they have laws, and they learn it at school, at university, how to work with governments. They get licensed. All these things happen because we decided it wasn't cool when somebody just built a building anywhere, and sometimes it fell on people, right? Okay, so basically ICT buildings are also falling on people, right? So let's see if I go through it. So yeah, I'm going to skip this. This is about inequality. We'll talk about that later if you want. But this is the program that's falling on people, right? We've heard about this. But there's more. It's not the only program that's falling on people. Okay, the thing I really want, and this is about sustainability. It's really important. Okay. But what I really want to get to, not this either. This is other stuff. This is after the end of the talk. This is what I really want to talk about because of that great movie. Okay. If we anthropomorphize AI, if we think, that thing that was being sexist and racist, it was just, if you guys know any math, it's a vector. You're just counting how many times words occur next to each other. It's nothing like a person. It has no motivations. It's not a monkey. It doesn't care about if it's owned. It doesn't care about if it's lonely. Nothing like that. And yet it knows things, not just sexism and racism, it knows things like that flowers are more pleasant than insects. Right? Or that musical instruments are more pleasant than medical instruments, right? So the point is that when we anthropomorphize, if we think, oh, because it's intelligent, it must be a person, then we basically are saying things like, the fifth reason that I don't like that, is that we're saying, oh, hey, you big company, why don't you fully automate part of your business process, that is, get rid of all the jobs, and then we'll cap out your tax and legal liability, right? So this is this big problem, right? Yeah, try suing a bankrupt robot, right? And this is actually already a problem. And so I'm hoping that as we start reasoning about AI, we might get a little bit smarter about the overextension of legal personhood we've already had. So yeah, my nightmare is autocrats willing money and power to some kind of AI chatbot, right? So I'm not going to even try to get through this. I could talk at length about this, but I'm not going to. I just want to say, I'm not even going to say that. Just read this paper. Okay. All right, thank you.
Hey, thank you so much, Joanna. And now we're going to move on to Helen's presentation. And I'm just going to tell you a few words about Helen. So, Helen Knowles is an artist exploring AI ethics and accountability. She has a BA from Glasgow School of Art and MFA Fine Art from Goldsmiths University. She lectures widely around the UK and abroad. And she is one of the 7 artists on the Fault Lines program at Future Everything. She is the curator of the Birthrights collection at King's College London and was recently shortlisted for the Deutsche Bank D-Base Prize. And she's a recipient of awards from Arts Council England and Amateurs Trust, and has won the Neo Art Prize. So, welcome, Helen.
Yeah. Slides. Yeah, that's the one. Okay, hello everybody. Thanks for watching the movie. Okay, should I pick it up? Better? Okay. Thanks very much for watching the movie. My name's Helen Knowles. I'm an artist. I'm not an expert in AI. That's the first thing to say. And I was also told that I was meant to ad-lib, so I'm going to ad-lib. I haven't prepared exactly. So this piece of work, and I'm going to talk about why I made this work and the background towards it, and then some of the reasons or things that I'm interested in. So how'd you get... Oh, sorry. Okay, cool. So this film is actually an installation. It's on show at the moment at ZKM in Karlsruhe. And Karlsruhe? I can't say it properly. So I think the most important thing about this work is that it's a collaboration. Basically, I got real lawyers to write the prosecution and defence speeches. I had a jury that was completely unplanned, you know, in the sense that it was unscripted. The variety of characters in the courtroom, which included a lawyer from, not a lawyer, a journalist from the Financial Times, who wrote on the blog about it. You know, it was like the whole piece came together in a really weird and synchronistic way. And so this computer was actually probably one of the early inspirations for the work. It was built by an artist called Daniel Dressel. And I mean, I was just fascinated by it because it is a real computer, but it's completely transparent. And so it sort of, it shows the architecture of, you know, the cables and sensors and whatever within a computer. And I find that kind of, when Joanna talked about physicality, I'm very interested in the virtual versus the physical. And actually that is very much what the film's about in some ways, thinking about like the vertical sovereignty versus the physical sovereignty. And I was thinking about that in terms of like the courtroom, the feel, the materiality of the courtroom. It was like, it's a courtroom in the age of austerity. You know, everybody was talking about the way it's a flagship courtroom. There's loads of courtrooms in there in Southwark, in London, and it's about to be, they want to close it down. And it really was decrepit. I mean, you can see that in the movie. Like like the carpets are held together with tape. And so I was interested in that and the clash of like this kind of technological, contemporary newness of AI somehow. And I was trying to kind of show that. I also was thinking about someone called Benjamin Bratton, who talks about these two sovereignties kind of colliding, basically. So, yeah, back to collaboration. So, yeah, I had 2 lawyers. They wrote the prosecution and defence. And literally it was, we sat down and, like, at the beginning, I didn't have a clue what the narrative was going to be about. It was just an idea. Oh, we'll put an algorithm on trial. And I sat down with them and we kind of worked out, well, the narrative kind of came through reading about the student loan book in the London Review of Books, and about it being worth a lot less than they say it is. And I just suddenly started to think about a narrative around big data. And then I kind of, talked with the lawyers, and we worked out how you could prosecute an algorithm, which is still not, because also what I've done with this piece is I've taken it to law schools. I've shown it in a lot of law schools. And so it was that kind of like, it's like constantly trying to figure things out basically with other people who aren't necessarily artists, which is something I'm very interested in. And how, when you make something, an artwork can have a certain function and it can potentially impact on society. And I'm interested in that ambiguity because also I run an art collection, which is contemporary art on childbirth at King's College in London. And it's images of birth. And those images are placed throughout the corridors of a midwifery and medical school, and it's about how those artworks also have this double kind of function as an artwork and like could be, like a medical kind of educational image. So I'm interested in that kind of like weird tension of an artwork. So so the computer was made by Daniel Dressel. Again, it was interesting. It was kind of genderless. I was trying to decide whether or not in the courtroom, should the algorithm even be represented at all? Is that a bit more sinister, basically? But then I kind of like the comedic aspect of having this ridiculous computer in there. And obviously also it related to this idea of like exposing the hardware and infrastructure of AI, which of course it's completely reliant on, and servers are huge in the desert, and mining cryptocurrency takes billions of dollars, and et cetera, et cetera. So the structure that you sit on, which is a jury bench, I made with a joiner who I met at 5 o'clock in the morning at a nightclub, and I just knew he was going to be a good joiner, and basically we kind of worked together to kind of come up with this sort of futuristic bench, which is based on 12 seats, which is, the British jury is always 12 seats. I don't know if is it the same in Holland? No, you don't have a jury. The judge just makes the decision. Okay. Well, that's something pretty interesting about the British legal system, I have to say. So actually, and I wonder, in Jasmine, in Germany, is it the same? Does the judge make the decision, or is there a jury? So does that go over people's heads in Germany?
People understand that it's a jury.
Right. Okay. So I'm just trying to think what else I wanted to say. Physical functionality. Yeah, I suppose it's just this thing like of how an artist can impact in some way. It's not necessarily that you're going to change things, but I like the idea of the sort of people's consciousness somehow being shifted, I think, with artwork. And that's really a lot of what I do, I suppose, in terms of being an artist. Can't think of anything else to say at the moment. About AI, one of the things about the film, actually, the jury was unscripted, and when they started talking about the Eichmann trial, I was really amazed, because I'd actually watched sort of previously that Hannah Arendt film, and I think it's something about like the lengthiness and slowness of a trial, and like the film is quite slow. I mean, it's kind of almost tedious at times, I think. But I think like courtrooms are quite tedious, and I quite like that. And the thing about, like this idea, the banality of evil, or like there's a kind of like, I hope that there's a kind of subtlety to its tedium somehow. I think that's what I was trying to get to. Yeah, that's it. All right, cheers. Oh, I didn't show you the rest of my slides, sorry. Just very quickly. Sorry, that's the computer up close. I got, we had that was the last lot of collaborators was courtroom drawers. So some of these drawings are by me, some of them by other artists. And that's probably one of the better ones. That was quite nice. That was the very first iteration, was a performance of this work in Wales. And at the same time this work was being performed, before it was shot as a film, there was another performance happening where two people were kissing in the background, which was quite nice. And this is me taking it to law schools in Westminster Law School with other academics. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. We will have Maaike Harbers, who is a research professor in artificial intelligence and society at the Knowledge Center, Creating 010, and a senior lecturer at the Creative Media and Game Technologies program, both at Rotterdam University of Applied Sciences. Her work focuses on AI, ethics, and design. She studies how designers can create interactive, intelligent technology in a responsible way by accounting for the ethical implications of their concepts during design time. So, welcome, Maaike.
Hi, thanks for having me here. Yeah, so the slides. Yeah, cool. So that's me. So I have a background in artificial intelligence. I think the Netherlands is one of the few countries that already has a degree in AI, a bachelor's and a master's for years and years. People abroad are always surprised by that. I've been doing research, and for the last couple of years I'm working on artificial intelligence, ethics and design. And now at Rotterdam University I work a lot with designers that are making stuff for creative technologies. So people that do UX design, user experience design, interaction design. And together with them we are exploring how they can work with artificial intelligence as a design material. For this talk, I was thinking about, well, responsibility and artificial intelligence, and who's responsible for whose actions. And I was thinking of, do we have this relationship do we have other examples? And it already came up somewhere, also in the film, like a child. We as parents are responsible for the actions of our children. I came up with the example of a dog. As a dog owner, you are responsible for your dog. Actually, it was about 2 weeks ago, I was at a terrace having a coffee, and what I saw, there were two dogs, a little puppy and a bigger dog, and the bigger dog got distracted by the puppy and it ran towards it and it bumped into a table, and there was a cappuccino on that table and a woman working on her MacBook, and the cappuccino was spilled over the MacBook with milk and sugar, and that was crashed. So there was a discussion, and the man said, well, dogs can break a MacBook, and people were, yes, they can. So the man, the owner of the dog, was responsible in this case. Now here we see this dog, but I have another dog here. Now, if you would be the owner of a dog, for which dog would you rather be responsible? I would pick the golden retriever. I don't know what the other dog type is, but it likes showing its teeth, and I would. The other one seems more faithful. And my point is that, like there are different dogs, there are also different AI systems. So here are a couple of them. I chose 3 examples of cars. Like at the left, you see just a normal car. a human driver, human is driving that car. Then the picture in the middle shows a self-driving car, but there's still a person sitting behind in the driver's seat, and there's a steering wheel. So, like any time, this driver could take the steering wheel and take over. Now, the first picture, that is called a human in the loop. The human is completely necessary for the car to drive. The second one, in the second picture, the human is on the loop. So the AI system is doing what it does, but at any time, the human can take over. Now, in this last picture, that's a driverless car without a steering wheel. So it's impossible for the human driver to take over. And that's called a human out of the loop system. Now the question is the human really out of the loop? You could say there is, at some point, there is a human in the loop, even in this picture, because probably the human enters the car and enters the destination where it wants to go to. Only the extent of time where the human is not doing anything is much bigger in this last picture. So there are different ways to design your system. And I think that designers of AI systems can enable humans to take responsibility. If you are in a car without a steering wheel, you cannot steer away if something goes wrong. It's up to the system and not up to you. And then it's much harder to say, I take responsibility for the actions of this car than like when there's a steering wheel, you can. I talk about designers, but I take it very broadly here. So those are also the programmers, but people that create an AI system. I just use designer because it's easier to talk about it. So it really depends on how you design an AI system, whether people are in the position to take responsibility or not. Now, I think this is something we really need to think about, because the impact of AI systems is getting bigger and bigger, and AI systems are everywhere. So where should humans be able to take responsibility or to redirect, to take control, and where not? And a concept that is often used is meaningful human control. This came up in the context of military. There's a lot of autonomous weapon systems or killer robots, they're also called. And in the debates around that topic, the term meaningful human control is often used. So a lot of people think that if we talk about weapon systems, the system should never make the decision to kill a human being, another person. So there should always be some human in the loop or on the loop to make that decision. Now, if we want to implement or design, create meaningful human control, how does that work? Well, that's a design challenge. That is about how people interact with AI systems. What I can say about it now is that there are different points at which human can exercise control. I think there was already some pictures, so it's nice to be the last speaker, so other people do some of the explanation already. But data go into an algorithm, the algorithm makes inferences, and then there's a decision. Now, it would be nice to have control over the data that go into a system. For example, if I'm on social media and in my news feed, in my timeline, there are movies or there are cat videos, and I may really like them, and at some moments I like to watch cat videos, but I don't want my timeline to be full of just cat videos. So it would maybe be a nice feature to, in social media, say, okay, don't take this into account for learning about my preferences. I just want to have some guilty pleasures now, like just watch stupid stuff. and also for maybe Netflix or Spotify. You sometimes want to listen to music that you don't want to really have your recommendations based on. Well, in case of a social media, this is just maybe fun. You get better recommendations, but if algorithms are making decisions about jobs, whether you are suitable for a specific job, it would be nice maybe to tell the algorithm not to take your gender into account or your religion, because it's not important for whether you're able to do the job well. Well, then the algorithm makes inferences. Often now we don't know about the inferences that the algorithms make, and it would be really nice to have the possibility to see what inferences the algorithm make and maybe correct them or change them. I've heard about situations where Facebook's algorithm thought someone was a homosexual, but the person was not, and it's really hard to change that. Then the decision. If an algorithm makes a decision with really high impact, well, in the case of autonomous weapon systems, it's very clear, or other decisions with a lot of impact, we may want to have control there too. So, for example, before doing something with a lot of impact, we maybe want to have a human in the loop or on the loop checking, is this really what we want, yes or no? So these are places to implement meaningful human control. Now, another term I would like to introduce is interpretability. People talk a lot about transparency of AI systems, of algorithms, but I prefer the term interpretability because algorithm or transparency, well, maybe we saw there was a glass box with the algorithm in it, but that didn't make us understand the algorithm. And you can see maybe code of like programming code of algorithm. And if that code is available, then it may be transparent, but most humans don't understand it. So that's why I prefer to talk about interpretability. Also there, you would actually, in order to exercise meaningful control, you need to know what's going on. So to know which data you want to go into an algorithm, yes or no, you need to know what kind of data is going in there. And I think it's a challenge for designers to come up with solutions that make that very visible. For example, if you have a video recorder, when there's a red light, you know it's recording. And that's a really nice. And the same way, I think designers and artists can come up with creative solutions to show what data are used in an algorithm. Then the algorithm itself, or AI system, there we would like to know what inferences the algorithm make or how it came to its decision. And that's quite a challenge, especially then it really depends on how the algorithm is programmed. So there are different AI techniques, and some use a more symbolic representation, and that's a representation that is easier to translate to something that we humans understand. But you probably have heard of neural networks. That's a representation of information that is not human readable. So that is a real challenge to make that interpretable, but I do think it's something we should research and come up with solutions for that. And also, again, the decision, it's in order to exercise control over a decision, you need to know what is going to happen, and in order to change. Creating more understanding of an AI system can be can have different forms. That can be verbal explanations by text or speech, But you can also think of how does the AI system look like? Because research shows that the appearance of an AI system, for example, of a robot, determines the expectations that humans have of an AI system. So by giving it the appropriate appearance, you can also kind of explain or give insight into the capabilities of a system. I would like to end with this notion. So as the design of AI systems has an effect on how users or people that use or deploy AI systems, whether they can take responsibility or not, or the extent to which they can take responsibility, that implies that the designers also have a responsibility to make sure that people that use or deploy an AI system can exercise or can take responsibility. So, yeah, designers have a responsibility to create interpretable AI systems over which human can exercise meaningful human control. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Maaike. So now I'd like to invite the three panelists to join me over there where we will have some time for a discussion. So I have a few questions to ask, but it'd be great to see what questions we also have in the audience and what you'd like to hear about. I might actually just keep this microphone because it's working. Yeah, so thank you so much for your presentations, and it was great to hear from three quite different perspectives, kind of from the AI side, artist perspective, and then also kind of your designer's view on these systems. And just to kind of start us off with, nowadays we have a lot of these discussions about the ethical side of AI, and how do you see the roles of artists, designers, and researchers, so kind of the communities you represent in this field? What can kind of they do to solve some of the issues in the field?
Should we each take a turn? Or
Yeah.
I think that who wants to start? I'm holding a microphone, but okay. So I have to say I don't only think of myself as an academic, because I did spend 7 years as a programmer. So I think myself, I guess, in three roles: an academic, like a professor, a programmer, and then also now I'm starting to learn about being a manager as you get a more senior role. And so I loved your last slide. Because I felt like some of your earlier slides, you kept saying the human when you meant the user. So when we talk, in fact, I appreciate your point about interpretability, but my group specializes in transparency, and the term is something we got, the IEEE uses it to mean what you mean. But it's interesting because transparency is different depending on who you're talking to. So transparency for the users is different than transparency for the law. It's different for transparency for the programmers and the designers. And that, again, is different from, like, if you had professionals that were going to come and install an AI system in your house, like a nurse or somebody like that. So, as you say, it has to be something understandable, but depending on what your education system is and your background is. So we need to think about all of these levels of interpretability. So I agree with you that there's a lot of responsibility on the designer, but in a corporation, I don't like to see the designer scapegoated. So I think ultimately this relies on the executive and the board of the corporation, that they create a context in which designers are required to do this. And similarly, what all of us can do as citizens is make sure that we want our governments to ensure accountability. I'm sorry to go on, I'll go a little bit longer, which is that there have been cases in Germany where cars already have a little bit of AI. And a car that had, unfortunately, someone suffer a stroke, so he still had his hands on the wheel, but he was not asleep, so the AI didn't recognize that he was not in control. And so the car struck and killed 2 members of the family. And the father was left alive with a huge liability settlement. He said, I don't want money, I want to find out what went wrong. And the car company is able to prove due diligence, right? So they were able to show, because they're a car company, they're used to this, they had this complete record of all their methods and why they had trained it and how the system worked. And so people could say, yeah, it's incredibly unlikely to have a stroke where your hands are still on the wheel. We understand you're not further liable. Now, if you have a company and your motto is move fast and break things, do you think you can prove that kind of liability? So I think if we as citizens demand accountability and are informed enough to understand that the corporations and the people making decisions about the corporations are responsible, then they will be motivated to make it transparent so we use it correctly, and so that the right people get held. Then transparency becomes a defense of the corporation to prove they've done the right thing.
Yeah, I actually, that is something I forgot to mention. I do think, and I completely agree with you, I do think that designers have a responsibility. That's what my slide said, a responsibility, but they are definitely not the only ones with responsibility. Because we are now thinking, I'm working with really young designers, and we are teaching them about, for example, privacy by design and take your responsibility. But we are very much aware they start as juniors in companies, so a company, like, they're probably just going to do what their boss tells them, and if they don't, they will probably not last very long in that company. So I do think we need to educate future designers to make them aware about the consequences of their design choices, and to, like, so they know what they make that has ethical consequences. But that's definitely not the only point. And indeed, bigger companies, and they have a responsibility, more the management, and governments can create policies that create the right incentives for companies to actually create more systems that are better, I would say, fairer, or that's, for example, the GDPR, the new European privacy regulation is such an incentives. And then I think artists are also can play a role. Well, you know more, but I really like art projects that create awareness or question some of these things. Yeah.
Yeah, I just think artists live a little bit outside of, like, societal structures in a way. So they get the chance, so they can ask more difficult questions, I think, or they have the they can take responsibility for being a bit more maverick, I suppose. So, yeah, that would be my four-penner.
I agree with you. I remember I first came across your work when I was at the Zabludowicz collection a couple of years ago, and there was a performance, actually, of this trial. And, of course, seeing something live, so these computer scientists, lawyers, and members of the public put this algorithm on trial, and to hear their discussion is something that is kind of much more memorable than these constant articles on the BBC News with the Terminator. So, yeah, I do think we need more of these artistic projects to kind of give us alternative examples and raise these concerns. And yesterday we had Mimi Onuoha give a talk here at Impakt, and yeah, she's an artist who looks at data sets and thinks about those that are missing. And I remember one of the comments that she made was that recently, like, some of her works or projects have become less relevant because there's been so much discussion in the mainstream and I guess progress being made. So would you say that you kind of share her opinion that there has been a lot of progress in the field already, or?
I mean, just to quickly say something.
Yeah.
I made that piece 2 years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago. And it feels like things have shifted massively in that time, particularly around, like, even just recently receiving all the emails from companies about protection of your data. All of a sudden, I don't know if everybody else is getting those emails, which I'm actually getting. Like, I just keep pressing like the cross button to like not do anything about it, which is really bad. But like, you know, I feel like it's like moving very quickly. The kind of like people are starting to really think about ethics actually, and well, also because like, you know, like what's his name, Zuckerberg, Mark, you know, like, you know, when things have started to move, I think so.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I see what she's saying. Everything is moving so fast, and that's so cool in a way. And I do think this is also partly the AI and the social media and all that we as a planet can get our heads around something when we realize, maybe a little late, but you know, when we realize it's important. But yeah, like I said, you heard me say this slide isn't important anymore. Oh, this slide isn't important anymore. Like 2 months ago, Cambridge Analytica was still something most people hadn't heard about. But 2 years ago, people were still saying, oh, AI is never going to happen. Nobody says that now. So, and also, I can say, like, the OECD, that I was at their meeting both in 2016 and 2017. Unbelievable progress of, like, governments and different organizations that get things matter, you know. So I feel like we're all, as a society, making a lot of progress. And it is frustrating when you have to change all your slides now.
Yeah, I completely agree. And so, like, something I noticed, what I really like, so people are more aware about AI, but recently several smaller companies came actually to me with the question, we want to do something about ethics, and how can we design in an ethical way? Are there tools for that? And there were companies, and it was not the CEO of the company, but an employee that just like employees that just like to do that. But I thought that was very, very cool. I was very happy about it. Yes.
I had a guy from Facebook come to, I was talking about AI ethics at the House of Lords, and he came up after me, and we talked once, and then he stopped answering my mail, so I don't know. But he had come from Microsoft, and he said, oh, I really want to understand this, because, you know, I don't want to say what his job was, but anyway. Yeah.
I'm going to change my microphone. Maika, in your slides, I really like it how you kind of simplified or explained the structure of how some of these AI systems work. So you mentioned kind of the data side, the algorithm, and the decision. And what do you think is the main area that we need to kind of control or influence the most in terms of designing systems that are able to kind of represent and do the best for society?
Yeah, I really think all. And it's hard to neglect one of those, but I really think all. The data really determines what an algorithm learns. So they say garbage in is garbage out. Some people think of an algorithm as something, wow, that is really cool, but the data are really, really important. If you don't have good data, then the outcome won't be good. But also having control over and more insight into what, in what happens in the algorithm is also really, so I really think all are really important. I don't want to pick one.
Oh, we all have to answer this?
No, you don't. I was just wondering.
I will just say there is the data, there is the algorithm, but another thing people forget about, like I said, is the physical process. So these big companies, they own in rivers. You mentioned this a little bit about how much energies. They own rivers and they dam them so they don't have to pay for the electricity. So we need to realize that it's not only about, you know, taking possession of our, the algorithms are being given away sometimes, and the data. Maybe now we're going to have a new EU data lake, which is great. But it is also about the processors and the computers, and once you get so much wealth in one place, it's hard to replicate that. So, although China's paying a lot of money to try to do so, and now the EU will too. So we'll see what happens, but it's a very interesting process.
And moving kind of away a little from the algorithms and the data and more towards the players behind these technologies. I see lots of nods, so I'm probably going in the right direction. And certainly we have all these companies such as Google and Facebook who spend a lot of time and energy developing and advancing these algorithms. And let's say the government and the state, so the traditional protectors of the individual and the population, I'm personally not sure how much they are doing in this space, and I was wondering what you thought about this dynamic with a lot of power lying in the private hands and not so much.
The thing that I'm really interested in is this idea of digital sovereignty and the creation of like self-sovereign identities. I was just recently at a cryptocurrency conference, and there are like businesses that are helping to create these self-sovereign identities, which is where your identity is being verified by your kind of pool of acquaintances, I suppose, online. And I suppose I'm interested in that, you know, the old kind of sovereignty that where our allegiance was to the state. You know, we hold a passport, we have a birth certificate, we pay our taxes, you know, and in return we get certain benefits. And now we've got this kind of global sovereignty that's transcending borders, and the kind of faces of governance, I suppose, like my kids have more allegiance to Facebook than they do to the UK government, right? They spend more time, you know, checking Instagram, right? So, you know, when you start to think about who you place your trust in, like this is just changing massively, and obviously we've been exploited. We've signed lots of contracts in the last however many years, you know, to use certain platforms so that we can, you know, get Google location, et cetera, we've given over our data, and you know, how this is all going to kind of play out, you know, in the future, I don't know. I don't know. I suppose it's like, who has the power at the moment, and the people who have the power are the people who hold all the data banks. So, you know, somehow there's got to be challenges. And
Okay. All right. So I'm going to give this time I'll totally disagree. I'll give a completely opposite view on this. That was some of the slides I skipped over a little bit. So it feels like all the power is in the people with AI, and to some extent that's true because we keep finding more and more stuff we can do with data. So I think one of the reasons that inequality is increasing so much right now is because a lot of the transactions are these free transactions, and now you've heard that means that you're what's being sold. I don't believe that. What I believe is you're bartering. You're bartering your data for their data, and that's why you feel good about it. You enjoy getting what they have, and they enjoy getting what you have. And then nobody knows what that's worth. Like 5 years later, you figure out a new way to use that data, and there's this huge value it created. So, you know, Google was worth nothing for, 7 years, and suddenly it's like this most valued company, right? So that was when we figured out what to do with that data, which was basically steal advertising from newspapers and give it to Google, right? And then suddenly they were worth a lot. So I don't say steal, they did outcompete them fairly, but it's a real problem, and one of the biggest problems on the planet right now is how to fund real news. But my point is that, so there's a problem, but it's a problem we've had before. The same thing happened in the early 20th, late 19th century with oil and newspapers. When you have a new technology, suddenly there's this new massive power. And then that's destabilizing. A small number of people have an enormous amount of money, and everything starts rocking. They started having more power than countries. We have wars, we have identity politics, lots of bad things happen. I don't think that's all about technology. I do think it's a lot about power and money, and some of that's conventional. We can't get away from the fact that if the person next to you isn't paying for fire insurance, if their house burns down, it affects your house. You know, especially in cities like this where the houses are the same walls, right? You can't ignore your neighbors, and you can't ignore your national government for that reason. So I think it is an issue. It's an issue because some companies have more money and some individuals have more money than a lot of countries. And I think it's an issue of redistribution, and we all have to get on the bandwagon and say, yes, we need to invest back into the kinds of organizations that can regulate these large powers and get everything a little bit more smooth, a little more even.
But that, I mean, I think that's, I don't know what anyone else in the audience must have something to say about this, because we can't keep talking forever. But yeah, I mean, it's all very well to say, oh God, I've lost my train of thought now. You were talking about, sorry.
I was talking about reinvesting in national governments
but I suppose the point is that like things are changing, and they're not changing in favour of legislation and democracies. They're changing, I would say that they're changing in favour of, you know, like if you go to a cryptocurrency conference, it's all about incentivization based on finance. You know, you do things for your benefit and other people's benefit, but because it's financialized, it's incentivized through financialization. You know, like this idea of like governance and altruism and looking after society is not, I don't think that's what people are thinking about at the moment. And it's, you know, I don't think it's right, but you know, I think you're being...
I totally agree with you, and I think that's actually what I'm currently actively researching. How can we make it, again, more visualizable to people? One of the great, terrible things that happened is when science told people that Darwin's theory shows that it's stupid to be altruistic. You know, if you read past the title of The Selfish Gene, the whole book is about the fact that even though genes are selfish, they cooperate all the time, and that cooperation is smart. That's how biology works. There are no single gene organisms, and there's no single person societies, right? A single person gets eaten by a leopard or something, right? So cooperation is completely natural, and yet you got a bunch of people that were taught it was stupid and that nature is selfish, and that it's only like stupidly Christian or something to cooperate. No, it's completely natural and biologically correct to cooperate up to a point. And getting that, communicating about those kinds of thresholds, about how governance works and how AI works, that's a big challenge. It's a challenge we really, really, really need the arts for. I don't know who else can communicate to humanity.
Okay. But that takes us back to this idea of responsibility, I think, and like computational governance is about devolving power to a computer as opposed to... You don't think it is?
No.
Shall we see what the audience thinks? Do you have any questions?
If I could just say really quickly, the guy that does policy for the Church of England, go and look for like Joanna Bryson and Malcolm Brown in Imperial College. This guy was amazing at seeing, you say you're devolving to computers, but the computer is a smokescreen. There's a person behind the computer. Power is something that's held by people. And only people, justice only works on people too. So while the computers are becoming a really good fulcrum, there's a person or a corporation, a legal person, either a person or a legal person is at the other end of the fulcrum. So, okay, but I agree the audience should ask questions.
Then maybe to get back a bit to like the question of the bigger companies. Like one thing you said, it's a bargain, our data for their data. I would like to point out that I do think there's a that's not an equal relation, not at all, because. For example, Facebook and Google know a lot about us, and we know fairly little about them, and it's really hard to reach them, and that we don't know how their algorithms work. So that's an unfair relationship. And also there have been bigger companies before, so it's not all new, but right now so many things are connected to each other, and these big companies can reach like a lot of people and influence them pretty directly. For example, in the U.S. elections, and I don't think that has happened before at this scale.
I just want to say I totally agree. Two things. One, total compliment to those people who organized that thing at the beginning. They chose the most important moment there. The fact that they had hundreds of thousands of people who played that Facebook game, and then they got controlling information of every adult American. That's hundreds of millions. Okay, so the connectivity is a new thing, I agree, actually, and I think every time that we get these transformations of technology, they change the power landscape, and then we have to reinvent governance. So I think maybe one of the things we have to think about is that we have to work with these companies almost by treaty, because they have as much power as a company. But we still, I mean, not as a company, they have as much power as a country, as a really big country. But countries figure it out usually. Right? I think it'll be like that.
So I believe we had one question in the audience.
Yay.
Please tell me if I'm saying something that you're already planning, but since we saw the film by Helen and we heard the prosecution and the defense, I'm very curious how the audience would vote, like guilty or not guilty. So we could do that test now.
Sure.
Or at the end of the evening, where there's more defense and more voices from the prosecution.
No, I'd like to see it now that you brought it up. Let's do that.
So, who thinks guilty? No, huh?
Nobody.
Who says unguilty? Well, that's boring.
Well, I have issues with either guilty or innocent being applied to the algorithm. As I mentioned, it's a part of the company, and if the company's gone bankrupt, it should be gone. If it's not deleted, it shouldn't be able to operate at least, right? So I don't see it as an actor, but within the British law, that does mean not guilty, apparently, which I learned. I think in Scottish law that they could be undecided or something. There's some like weird third verdict in Scotland. Not proven. That's what it said. Not proven.
I think it's interesting, though, to note that like rivers have been given legal status, and non-human, like.
Oh, I know all about that. Actually, no, literally, I've written a couple books, a couple papers about this, and there's other better papers about the river thing. Rivers are, and also idols, okay? So there are things that people see themselves as being a part of, that become religious status, so that the people are injured when the things get injured. And so that's how it was an interesting way. The rivers was status was the indigenous people, I believe that was New Zealand, were able to say that it was an idol in order to defend it from pollution, right? But that's, so yeah, and India gives, similarly, they give, India gives status to idols, like stone idols, wood idols, that could be damaged, and then that would damage the people that worship them. Now, so first of all, the people are the moral patients. But secondly, what's important in both those cases is that there's one unique copy that if it was destroyed, it could not be replaced. And that's something that's not true of software unless someone's sort of being malicious, right? You can back up software. And I think that's, again, remember that AI is something we build and we design. I love this thing about the designing, right? So we can decide whether or not we back up our systems. I met a doctor once that had, very early PDA. Before the smartphones, there was these little things. Anyway, he lost it. And I'm like, why did you own that except to back it up? He had his patient's data on this thing, like he lost a notebook. Well, the reason I got those things was because I lose notebook, then my stuff is gone. If I lose my laptop, I buy another laptop, and I've only lost 1 week of notes or something because I've backed it up a week ago, hopefully. All right? Yeah.
Forgive me for wild formulation, because it just gave us this clear image while you were talking about the, Western state achieving quite, it just doesn't like me, quite advanced level of these algorithmic technologies. And at some point I just thought, Soviet Union at some point in the 70s was quite heavily into cybernetics, and unfortunately, of course, it didn't go anywhere because the government was not able to support this. in the 90s anymore. So I'm wondering, maybe a question to all of you who wants to answer, but to Joanna first, because I think you kind of said this definition of intelligence, of doing the right thing in the right time, which I think is super crucial to algorithms, because it's exactly what they're doing with their right time, which is inaccessible to us, you know, like microtemporality of stock, or I don't know, when a machine, a self-driving car makes a decision, etc., etc. So I was wondering, what do you think about these alternative forms of governance? For example, blockchain is seen sometimes as something that can establish some commons. At the same time, it's mostly been used to accrue value, I think, so far. So are there any thoughts on that?
I think it's interesting, the idea of like, you know, you're talking about people essentially, you know, they're programming an algorithm, and you're talking about it a bit like a recipe. But there are arguments that it isn't like a recipe, right? The interesting thing about the blockchain, I think, is the idea that you've got all these different nodes kind of validating. So, you know, like it's a ledger that's kind of like, and, you know, sort of almost like voting, really, as well. You know, the tokenization thing is like voting, essentially. So it is algorithmic governance, but it's also like this idea that people are kind of like somehow manipulating it, and, you know, the majority of people, I think, what is it, 51% say yes, so
Yeah.
So it does come down to people, really.
Yeah, and you know, and the whole idea that that blockchain can verify something, it's like, no, it can only verify the order in which something was entered into the blockchain, but you could have lied when you entered it, right? So there's how do you make sure that this is actually guaranteeing all these contracts? It's like a new way to write stuff down, and that might be useful. For verifying the exact order things happened, and that whether documents have been changed, but the documents themselves are still things that have to be enforced human to human. So I think, yeah, and it's true that there's, you know, as I said before, there's all kinds of AI, and some of it is more transparent, or sorry, what were you were using, not transparent, and I was going to do your term. Interpretable, right? So some of it is more interpretable than others, and I'm not saying that every line of code, everything in AI is lines of code you can read, or indeed sometimes when it is, then you can't read it because it's too long, right? But there's too many lines of code. But somebody has architected the system. I didn't use the architecture thing randomly. So someone decides about where do you use the learning. How much are we going to use the learning? What are the limits of the learning? How have we decided when the system's gone off the rails? It's just like human systems are at least as complicated as AI systems. Human systems are more complicated. So if you go and you audit a company, you don't look at the synapses in the brains of the accountants, you look at the accounts, right? So you're not in a worse situation when you've trained these systems. If it's a well-known algorithm, you know the data that went in, you know the data that came out, and you can test it over and over, like, okay, if I change the name from African American to European American, what happens, right? And it's incidentally, last I knew, this is a bridge from yesterday, but you showed the pictures of unprofessional or whatever, and what was mentioned yesterday was this thing about people being tagged as gorillas. I believe that nothing is tagged as gorillas to this day by Google Images. That's just, they solved that problem by taking that word out, right? So we could check this, but yeah, so you build a system and you add these little layers in and say this is admissible and this is not admissible anymore.
Yeah, I believe we had one last question from the audience. There were two. I don't know. If we can take two questions, then perhaps the lady to the Right.
I think next week there start a new law from the European Community about privacy. Don't you think that new law is a farce in relation to AI? Because they know everything of you. When they take one picture, they know everything of you. In every restaurant, they take pictures nowadays. You see the drone in your film, in the court. What do you think about this relation? Don't you think it's a farce, it's nonsense?
I personally, there are definitely things that could be better in the law. But I do not at all think it's a farce, because I'm really happy it creates a lot of discussion about privacy. A lot of companies, because the enforcement will be there will be very high fines. So it is really doing something, and I do think our privacy is really important. So I think it's great that that is happening. That creates more awareness. And
just really briefly, that's a huge question, but I just want to tell you, I worry that you're right, but I'm spending my time trying to make sure you're wrong. So I think it's something what we do matters, and I think it was, as you said, a step in the right direction, but it really matters how it's held to account. I can give you a really quick example if I have time. Now the example fell to my. Oh, I know. There's this law that says your data can't be used in ways you didn't expect it. That's already true under data protection for since the 80s. Now that's so fluffy. How can you possibly use, your data can't be used in ways you couldn't expect it? That is how the British are prosecuting Cambridge Analytica. Okay, if it's sufficiently egregious, if it's a sufficiently big thing that, I liked 20, because the actual Cambridge, not Cambridge Analytica, the Cambridge University result is if they have 130, I think it was, Facebook likes, they can predict who you're going to vote for better than your spouse can. Okay? If you were liking pictures of kittens, you were not expecting someone to predict how you were going to vote. And that's sufficiently egregious. So even these things that, yes, they're getting abused all the time, but as long as there's some really big cases where we prosecute people for a lot of money when they make a big mistake, hopefully we can bring this down and get back control of it. But it is only hope, and you might be right.
Yeah. So last question.
I have a question. So about artificial intelligence, it's based on the data and also on the algorithm, how it's written and by whom and why and how it functions. Should there be any frameworks or regulations that determine when is an artificial intelligence an adult, or when is it goodly written? Because we validate how we teach our children, we validate other stuff, and we validate a car has to have 4 wheels and a steering wheel, and so on and so on and so on. So I can imagine if the data is so important for an algorithm or an artificial intelligence system, then we could create a framework in which we say we have to at least have these types of data or these types of image sets or whatever before we can use the AI.
Yeah, that's.
And if so, are there any examples of that already?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's what I was going to say. There already is that. You can't get into the iStore. So Apple super controls what goes onto their things. They check everything before they allow you to sell it for Apple platforms. So that every single program has to go through some kind of criteria, not to the level you maybe want. The financial industry, medical industry, we're talking about, is the right explanation possible, neural networks, blah, blah, blah. They already have accountability built into them, and there are already people working to to figure out ways to say, how deep learning works well enough that it allows it into the financial system. So yes, in small areas this exists. Again, about this progress that we've been talking about, 2 years ago, I heard somebody from Microsoft get up and say, you can't possibly regulate us because you'll destroy the magic juice and China will get ahead and this is terrible. By the end of that same year, the end of 2016, Microsoft was saying, we want transparency and accountability, and we're leading. They wanted to be the adults in the room because they're one of the older software companies. So I think that this is doable. It may slow down the rate at which new programs come out, but it may mean that programs that do come out are more stable and stay around longer. So the real long-term rate of innovation could go up if we start doing the right thing.
Yeah, I think maybe you were also thinking about like policy, like governments introducing policies about that. I think there are a lot of standards, for example, safety standards, and so I do definitely think it would be very helpful to have standards for example, security, cybersecurity, and it's hard to define those policies, but then if you have them, you can say, well, this product complies to this and this standard. I think that would be very helpful.
Yeah. And there are the like IEEE and what's the other, ICE, whatever. A bunch of these guys are doing standards efforts. Once there are standards existing, then the law will or will not be written to require that they use these standards. But that's what's happened with other engineering. AI is a little different, so we'll see how it goes. But there are people, literally, the people who write standards are starting to write these standards.
So I think at this point, we're out of time. So now we have to wrap up. Thank you so much to Micah, Joanna, and Helen for being part of this panel, and for you guys to come along, and that you guys came along. And I believe, yes, we do have. Do we have future events on the slide? Yes, we do. So I can't really read them from down here, but you should. And you should come along to them, and also to our festival at the end of October, 24th to the 28th of October. And I believe now the bar is still open, so you're welcome to join us there.